Hello and welcome back to the Jolly Ranchers YouTube channel. This week we are covering how to detect collision in Fungus without coding, and this will all be in Unity, a very popular software for game design. If you tuned in last week, I showed how it was possible to make Angry Birds without coding with 5 commands. Very easy stuff. And this week we are going to focus on how to detect when the player collides with an object, any object, be it invisible or block, like an Angry Bird knocks over. That way we could calculate the score or make a sound effect when the thing hits something, which is what I did. And I made the thing glow upon impact, and you can do a whole bunch of stuff. If you like these videos and if you want to support me, please wishlist my upcoming game, Kid Detective, on Steam. It would help me out a lot, and it's free, so thanks. Now let's get into the video. Okay, let's take a preview of how we're checking for collision in Fungus. And as you can see, I've added on to our game. We are checking for collision 2 different ways. One is when we hit a solid object. As you can see, when we knock over the tower, this happens. And one is a trigger. When we pass into the next room, we passed through a collider, which is acting as a trigger. And it triggered the event Room 2, and we switched to the Room 2 view. So let's go over how to actually do collision in Fungus. Collision checks, that is. If you were not here last week for the Angry Birds tutorial, this is the complete movement block for circle, for the green circle that shoots around when you click. First off, you're going to need to go to Tools, Fungus, Create, and create a flowchart, which is what this is. It is a game object with a flowchart on it, just covering the basics for anyone who might be new. And then I had a new block. I went to execute on event, input key pressed right there, and the key pressed type is key down, and the key code is mouse 0, which you have to scroll a long way down for. And then I used this get mouse position command, which you can do by double-clicking on this plus and going to the input commands, get mouse position. You get all of the commands that way. The next command, vector2, is in the property category, etc. So I did this. I made a mouse position variable, which I added with this plus button, and it's a vector3 variable, as you can see right here. So that's how I did all of this. I'll just click on each command, and so you can see all the individual settings. You can see the variables that I put in. And then this is some stuff that I made it to glow green whenever you click. And I unchecked the wait until finish on this one so that you can move the thing again while the ball sprite fades from being green. So that's how I did that. So for our building chunks, which is obviously what I'm calling them, let's actually make a new building chunk to show them how it's done. So I am just going to go up here and I'm going to create an empty game object. And I am going to name it, unsurprisingly, building chunk 5. So we have an empty game object, which looks like absolutely nothing. First thing we are going to need to do is we're going to need to add a sprite renderer to this game object. Press add component, type in sprite renderer, and add it. And I'm just going to type in square into the handy dandy search feature. So you can do a square or a triangle. Triangles are harder to knock over. I don't know if you know that. We have a square here, and if you're stuck on this move tool, you won't be able to stretch out the square. So I'm going to go to the move tool and stretch it up like so. I'll maybe make it a little skinnier so it's super easy to knock over. And I'm going to make it tall, so So it's extra satisfying. And then I'm going to click on the move tool and I'm going to move it closer to the ground so that when we add the rigid body, it will fall down. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to go down here, click on add component, type in rigid body, and we want the rigid body 2D because we're working in 2D. Let me just check what we did with our other rigid bodies. These are the settings we had on our other ones. So I'm actually going to go here to the 3 dots and I'm going to copy these values and paste it in the rigid body. And I'm going to click on the 3 dots here and paste component values. So it seems the only thing I changed from default was the mass of the object to 5. And so now we have a rigid body on it, and our gravity scale is 1. It's going to fall to the ground as soon as we start the game, but it's going to fall through the ground because it doesn't have a collider on it. So we are going to add a box collider 2D. If you just type in B, it will appear. And automatically it fits to the square object, but you can edit it if you so choose with these green dots if you click Edit Collider. So now we have a collider. We just need to detect it in Fungus using a flowchart, like these handy-dandy ones with this collision 2D block, which executes when we have a 2D collision. So go to your building chunk that doesn't have a flowchart on it and add the component Flowchart, which you should have if you downloaded Fungus. You can go to my video on how to get Fungus from GitHub. Fungus is not dead, I think is what it's called. Clickbait, am I right? So you can go here and open Flowchart window if you don't already have the Flowchart window open, and you can dock it up here or anywhere you want. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a new block. I just click the plus button up here, or you can right click, press add block. And then you're going to go up here to execute on event, and as I have shown, we're going to add collision 2D. And you can make this activate if you stay colliding with something or if you stop colliding with something, if you exit the collision zone. So that's just interesting options for you, but we are going to do it as soon as we collide, as soon as we enter the collision. And we want to store this collision, the collision with our ball, which is named ball 2, and there's only one ball now, so I'm just going to delete that so that there's only one ball. Let's go back to our building chunk 5. We are going to want to store the collision of the ball in a collision variable. As you can see, I've already created this collision variable, but you are going to go to the ball. You're going to click the plus button down here on variables. If the variables window is closed, you just click on that and it pops up. You can click the plus button and go to collision 2D, not to be confused with collider 2D, but obviously we're going to make one of those also. And I just named it ball collision, and importantly, I made it public so that I can use this variable from other flowcharts. And as you can see, I have lots of flowcharts already. So we can go back to our building chunk 5 now and store the collision data in our ball collision variable. And this collision data holds the information of the 2 things that have collided. And that is helpful because we want to know when the ball collides with this block, we could add, to our score total if we're doing an Angry Birds thing, or we could play a sound effect, which I'm going to definitely do, when they collide. So it's important to be able to know when 2 things collide and what those 2 things are, because they can have different interactions. I am going to add another command, and I'm going to add the collision 2D command. Now that we have put this data into a variable, we want to get that data of what it collided with. So I'm going to get the collider and our collision 2D variable where we're storing the information of what colliders are involved with this collision. As you can see, you can do other collider to get whatever the other thing that the ball is colliding with, which in this case would be building chunk 5. But we don't care about that because we just want to know what the ball collided with. we need a variable to store the collider of the ball, so we know if the ball collided with the block. We have a collider on our ball as well, which actually is not on the ball flowchart object, but is down here in scene for some reason. Just quickly going over what's on the ball is a circle collider and a rigid body with the default settings. So we're going to need to go to our ball flowchart, which controls the ball and us moving the ball. And we are going to want to make a ball collider 2D variable by clicking the plus button, collider 2D. And then we want to drag our ball, the actual ball with the collider and the rigid body on it. We want to drag it into the collider variable, or you can click this right here, and all of your collider 2Ds will show up in here, and you can click on ball 2. So now we're going to go back, and we have this ball collision data, and now we want to save it into a collider variable or an integer variable. I don't know how that works, so I'm going to do a collider variable because that's easier for me to understand, and you will see why. So I'm just going to add a collider 2D to our building chunk 5 flowchart, and I'm going to call it collider. And I am not going to add any collider 2D data to it because I'm going to be adding it with this collision 2D command. I'm going to get the collision information and put it in this collider variable right there. So we want to see if the collider variable, if it's equal to the ball, which on the ball flowchart, I went ahead and added a collider 2D variable, and I dragged in the ball in question, the ball that we move around as the player. So back in my building chunk 5 flowchart, I can say if this collider information is equal to, we could put ball 2 in here, or we could use our ball collider variable from the ball flowchart, which I'm going to do. Basically, if this building chunk collided with the ball, then we can play a special sound effect. I'm just going to put in a random sound effect from the ones that came with Fungus. As you can see with these other building chunks, I measured how many times you have hit the building chunk with your ball. And so I'm going to go ahead and add a integer variable and name it hit count. If the hit count reaches 1 on all of the building chunks, then you can go to the next level or something. So we are going to say if it collides, then we want to set variable hit count, and we are going to add 1 plus equals 1 is just adding 1 to the hit count variable every time they collide. And I went and made a variable in the ball flowchart called knocked blocks. And I also made another flowchart. This takes a lot of flowcharts. I'll be upfront about that. But there are not very many blocks in the flowcharts, so it is not very confusing, in my opinion. So I made a new block in a new flowchart, and I went to execute on event. I scrolled to the end of the mono behavior category, and I clicked update. And this just checks every frame. If knocked blocks equals 3, then we can go to the next room. I play a sound effect. I move the wall out of the way with a lean tween command, lean tween move, and I put in the vector 3, which I saved in my ball flowchart, which isn't very helpful. But the way I did that was I went to my scene, and this wall, which I wanted to move after I completed this level, I took it out into its own object, and to see where I wanted to move it, I just clicked the move tool up here and moved it up, and I looked at these numbers, which is the position I'm going to want this wall to go once I complete the first level. And then I went to my flowchart, and while I was still in my flowchart window, I clicked back on my door, and then I put these numbers into a vector 3 variable just so I could save it, but you could put those numbers also directly into your tween command. Instead of using a variable, you could use a value and just add the vector3 values into there. But I like to use variables so that if I use that value in more than one place, I can change the variable itself, and it's just a simpler workflow. So once knocked blocks equals 3, then we move the door out of the way, we play a sound effect, we set the room 2 flowchart to be active, which we have a trigger here, and we'll go over this trigger type of collision as well. And I went ahead and destroyed this flowchart. And the set active and destroy commands are here in scripting. Set active sets game objects on and off, and destroy destroys game object for the rest of the scene. But as you can see, when you come back out to editor mode, the game object is still here. So don't worry about destroying things if you are not planning on using them. So we want to measure the amount of knocked blocks that we have so we can figure out how to complete our level, because hit count is good if you want to do it based on hit count and say, you know, if hit count equals a certain amount. But the way I'm using hit count is if the block and the ball collide, then I actually want 2 parameters here. If hit count equals 0, so if we haven't hit this thing yet, then I want to set the variable knocked blocks, which I made public in the ball flowchart, so I can access it, just like this. That's how you set a variable public. And this only activates the very first time I knock into a block, because after that I don't want it to count. I want the player to have to knock down all the blocks to pass the level, and so I only want this to count once. So hit count being 0 will prevent that, because the only way we can add to the hit count is if the hit count is 0. So it'll be 1 after that. Only if we change the condition to and. So now the ball has to collide with the building chunk, and the hit count has to be 0 to add to the knocked blocks. And you could also put the score tally if you were making Angry Birds in here. You'd have a score variable somewhere, and you could add a certain amount of points for hitting. And actually, Angry Birds also measures how fast, how hard you hit an object, and you can also do that with the collision 2D variable. You can measure the relative velocity that the collision happened, which I think is pretty neat. And you could use that, and I actually might use that to do some sort of enemy fight later on. So something else I want to do is I want to have sound effects play no matter when the ball hits this block in particular. And I'll just copy and paste this because it's the same kind of thing I did before. If our collider variable is the ball and the ball hits the block, then I want it to make a sound, a funny sound. And I might even want the block to also light up green. So I'm just going to copy these same commands, these fade sprite commands that I had for the ball, and I'm going to copy those in here. So when the ball hits the block, I want the building chunk 5 to glow green. So I'm going to drag in the building chunk 5 into the building chunk 5 flowchart. And as you can see here, when you copy and paste commands, it doesn't save. It's using the variable from the place you copy and pasted it from the other flowchart. So you're just going to have to reference the collider variable that's on this flowchart and the things that you had. So in this one, I have it so that if the block falls over and it hits the ground, then, I put in all my ground chunks. I could even put in my ground chunks from the second room, which these are the ground chunks from the second room. Room 2 ground. So I can even add those, which I'll just go ahead and do. Just to show you how it's done, you drag in the thing that if it collides with, then it will make a funny sound. And all of my ground chunks have colliders on them too. so that'll work great. It'll make a sound. And if the block is way up high, sitting on something, and you want to measure if the person knocked the tower over and that block fell to the ground, then you could add the knocked blocks variable here. But if they're already on the ground, they're going to touch the ground as soon as the game starts. So you don't want to have this on your bottom building chunks, which, as you can see here, I do not have that on the building chunks that start touching the ground. And because building chunk 5 starts touching the ground, I don't want to have that add to the player's score. So I'm going to remove that variable. And this one is for if this building chunk hits other building chunks, it will also make a sound effect. So that is that for how collision works. And let's go and test it. Let's get to the second room and our building chunk is not here. Let's go and check where our building chunk actually is. We have to go into scene view, and it says our building chunk is here. Curious, but it's invisible. It's invisible, but not in scene view. Okay, the building chunk is definitely invisible because somehow the Z value of the transform has gotten wildly out of control. Because if we go here to 3D view, we can see that the building chunk is actually behind the camera, which the little camera icon is there. So if that ever happens to you, that's what's going on. Okay, so let's go see if it actually works this time. Nice, I beat the first level. We go to room 2, and let's knock this one over. As you can see, it turns green. It made sound effects when we hit it. Boop. And it makes sound effects when it hits the ground. Of course, it's already on the ground, so it's not going to make more sound effects, which is kind of what we want. So that's how to detect collision and how you might make an Angry Birds game as well. And let's go over the trigger, because as you can see, when we cross into room 2, our view shifts, and I went ahead and I made a Fungus view. Let's go back into 2D mode by going to Tools, Fungus, Create, and I created a view. I dragged it over to where I want the camera to go, and I changed the size to be the size I want. And then my room 1 flowchart has a game started block that brings up the title. After 2 seconds, I customized a say dialog, Tools, Fungus, Create, and I created a say dialog. I customized it. I deleted the panel behind it so that the words just appear big over the screen. And I made the story text real big, as you can see. I dragged it out real big like this. And I actually want to center this text in the middle of the screen. And then in my room 2 flowchart, I made a new block and I had it execute on event trigger 2D. And on my room 2 game object, as you can see, I have a box collider 2D because I went down here and added a box collider 2D component. And here in scene view, I moved the box collider 2D, which is not active right now with that check mark. And I edited the collider to be right when you enter room 2, but not before that, so that you don't enter room 2 before you're supposed to. And then I clicked is trigger, which allows you to pass through the collider without, you don't run into it. You can pass through it and it triggers an event. So in our room 2 flowchart, when we triggered the event, I did a move to view command, which is here under the camera, move to view. I said room 2, I play a sound effect. I wait 1 second, but I'm not waiting for the player to click through the dialogue. So after 1 second, the room 2 say command disappears. And then I added an extra say command so that the room 2 command actually does fade because an empty say command is after it. And then I set this flowchart to false so that we don't trigger the room dialog every time we pass through that trigger. We only want to do it once and move to the view one time. We could have a trigger back to room 1 that moves us back to room 1 as well. And this is how you do it. And I have another collider variable on this flowchart, which is where we store the fact that we collided with this trigger. So it's that easy. The trigger 2D has to be on the game object that has the box collider, the trigger box collider, and it just understands that when you run into that trigger, you want to play this block, which is so easy. So that is all. You don't want to mess with the tag filter. You can create new tags for objects. As you can see, I tried that, and the tag filter does not work. So what I think it wants you to do is go down here, add one parameter, and type in the tag building. And so only if, a building block ran into this trigger would the event get triggered, but it doesn't work. So I would the collision 2D command and get the collision data that you want for those things. Okay. That's it for this week. You can see how you could use this to do something like the interact system that I had in my 2D side-scrolling system, where your 2D player's walking along and talks to someone. When they collide with the trigger, the box collider trigger on a character, or when they pass a certain point, you pan the camera to the next area, Zelda style. So that is it for the video. And if you don't have a Steam account and you don't want to go to the trouble of making a new one so that you can wishlist my game, then you can like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. All of that's also free and will help support me making more videos, and our blessed editor, Zach, who does not get enough credit here. So thank you, and until next time, stay jolly.